G'day everyone, it's Raphael here. Now, as many of you know, I'm a corporate lawyer, more specifically a mergers and acquisitions lawyer. Now, I've worked in several top-tier international commercial law firms, and I've advised in different areas of practice. Now, the number one question that I get is, how much money do lawyers actually make? And this is honestly the biggest question in the legal world, and maybe even in pop culture, because if you watch Suits, you'll think that every lawyer drives a luxury car, wears a $5,000 suit, and bills $1,000 an hour. But the reality is, it's a lot more complex than that, and for most lawyers, unfortunately, a lot less glamorous. So today, I'm going to tell you a closely held secret. You have to promise that you don't tell anyone, because today I'm going to reveal how much lawyers really earn. Before we get started, there's a couple of caveats. Now, first, the practice of law is incredibly diverse. You have criminal lawyers, you have family lawyers, you have corporate lawyers like myself, you have personal injury lawyers, you have litigators, environmental lawyers, and you also have different places in which you can work as a lawyer. You can work at a private firm, which can be big, medium, or small. You can work in-house. You can work for the government. You can even work for yourself as a consultant or a barrister, and of course you can be a judge one day. Secondly, different jurisdictions will pay different amounts, and that will depend on the place you work. And thirdly, your individual capabilities will influence your earnings, and it's not just in reference to discretionary bonuses, but your yearly salary as well. So all of this means that there are a lot of variables and there's a wide range of income. So the data that I'm going to be presenting you today will be averages and a ballpark figure. And of course, all of this is for educational purposes only. So with that out of the way, let's break down the major factors that determine how much money you can earn as a lawyer. Now, number one thing is location. So if you're working in New York City or London, you're most likely to earn more than if you worked in a rural area or the suburbs, which is why when you watch Suits, where is it located? New York City. Of course, that's not always the case, because I do know plenty of lawyers who have offices in suburban areas and they are pretty well off. But that's really more to do with their business abilities and being able to funnel off a monopoly in that particular market. Now, the second factor is really practice area. Now, corporate law tends to pay more than criminal or family law. And this makes sense because corporate clients are massive and they've got a lot of money to pay their lawyers compared to a single person who needs help with a criminal matter or a family matter. The third is the type of employer. This is where things get a little bit controversial, but big law and top tier law firms, they tend to pay more than lawyers who work for the government or boutique firms and not-for-profits. Big law clients are companies, so it makes sense that they have large retainers and they can pay more. Fourth is experience levels. Seems pretty obvious, right? But many people don't realize that there's a significant gap between the pay of an associate and the pay of a partner or a principal of a law firm. 6, billable hours. Now, these are two words that, it brings a shiver down any lawyer's spine. But the fact of the matter is, in private practice, performance often drives extra pay. Now, again, this is something that's often marketed in big law. If you bill enough, you will get a hefty bonus. And finally, economic conditions. Salary freezes, market downturns, and inflation, it all plays a role. It seems obvious, but I need to be blunt with you because law isn't necessarily a secure profession. And unless you're working for the government, normally when there's a downturn, it really isn't a question of how high your salary increase will be, but more of a question as to whether you'll have a job or not. And this is where billables really come into play, because you need to make money for the firm in order to be employed by the firm. Law is pretty ruthless. So now that we have looked at the parameters of what affects the salaries of a lawyer, let's dive into real world numbers. So in Australia, you're going to earn between $65,000 and $95,000 as a graduate. However, when you graduate law school, you can't just call yourself a lawyer until you're admitted in the Supreme Court of your relevant state. And that requires completion of your practical legal training, which tends to be around 6 months to a year to complete. Now, after you're admitted, Then you can call yourself a lawyer. However, for the first 2 years, you are under supervised practice. So in your first year as a lawyer, you'll end up making around $70,000 to $107,000. And that scale depends on whether you're working at a small boutique on the low end or a top tier law firm at the high end. Now, after 2 to 4 years of being a lawyer, you'll generally earn between $90,000 and $150,000. And after 5 years of practice, you'll then tend to be in a position where you can be promoted to being a senior associate, whereas we call them an SA. When you're in this position, you're seen as being an experienced lawyer. So a first year SA will make between $120,000 and $190,000, and your salary will then keep going up year by year. You can even, I've seen this, even reach peaks of $450,000 after 10 plus years of being a lawyer. Now, that of course is very rare, and quite frankly, that is inclusive of any bonuses on top of your salary. So that data mark is pretty skewed. Now, after 10 or 15 years of being a lawyer, you are then in a position to make partner at your law firm. And this is where the world is your oyster, but it also means that there's a huge gap in salaries. So a lawyer can earn anywhere between $150,000 to millions and millions of dollars a year as a senior partner. Now, partners ordinarily they're referred to as owners of a practice, i.e. you're in a partnership. Therefore, you aren't earning a salary, you're taking a share of earnings from the profitability of the firm. However, it's actually way more rare for partners to actually have an equity stake in their law firms that they work in this day of age. Most partners are salary partners, and you earn an ordinary wage, and it's a high wage, but nowhere near the levels of an equity partner. I'm also going to say that partnership agreements, they're secured documents, and you're not allowed to disclose the contents of these agreements. And because your earnings are dictated by firm profitability and refers to having ownership of a business, the public will never get access to this information. So you guys will never really know how much a partner makes because it varies, but it's high. The other thing I need to mention is that these salaries that I've mentioned are for commercial law only. So criminal law and family law practitioners, they tend to earn less than these averages. However, at the same time, these lawyers tend to be more business savvy, and after 5 years of practice, most practitioners, they tend to go off and start their own boutique firm instead of staying at their large law firm. And this obviously means that they can earn more. Also, criminal law and family law, they are very court orientated, and that requires you to make a lot of court appearances. And many practitioners, they end up going to the bar to become barristers. Now, barristers, they are a whole different kettle of fish. They're essentially lawyers, and they work for themselves, and they do a lot of court advocacy. Now, ballpark range for court appearances, they tend to charge around $3,000 to $5,000 a day. And if you're a senior counsel, which is a senior barrister, in Australia, it used to be called Queen's Counsel when the Queen was alive. Now you have the King, and now it's called King Counsel, but they've changed the naming convention. You tend to be called senior counsel. In those situations, a senior counsel, they charge between $5,000 and $10,000. Actually, no, I've seen $15,000 a day, which is a lot of money. But for my business folks out there, this is revenue. So it's not profit, but it's still pretty high. Now, for my fellow Americans, you guys make considerably more money than we do in Australia. Now, I'm privy to big law salary because I worked for several big law, global commercial law firms. Bit tongue-tied there. But yes, the $200,000 plus first year salary, it's true. But be mindful, we're talking New York City or London or very big prestigious destinations. So that is really the creme de la creme, pretty much the highest you can get as a first year lawyer, which also means you need to have an Ivy League background or an Oxbridge background or a very prestigious law school background. You need stellar clerkships and extracurricular activities, and you need to bill a lot of hours. But if you do, you are rewarded by your salary that you're seeing on the screen right now. I would also add, Americans, you guys are so entrepreneurial, and your economy and your government really supports and incentivizes starting your own business. And this also applies to lawyers, particularly personal injury lawyers. So if you start your own personal injury law firm, you can make some serious bucks. For example, you might have seen these big compensation cases such as class actions in the billions, and PR law firms, they tend to take around 33 to 40% of the client's total recovery. But, and that might sound a lot, but they also operate often on the no-win, no-pay model. So that means many PI law firms, they tend to only get paid if they win or settle. So, like everything in life, don't just focus on the winners, focus on the losers as well to gain better perspective of how much you can actually earn. In the UK, the legal profession, it's sort of like a Charles Dickens novel. There's equal parts prestige, ambition, and the occasional shock. So a newly minted solicitor stepping into a Magic Circle law firm, they can expect to earn around $150,000, while their counterparts at elite American law firms in London, they might pocket around $180,000 right off the gate. Now, just an FYI, this is actually pretty common across the board. US managed law firms, like big law firms, they tend to always pay more than Magic Circle law firms and Big Six law firms, even when all the offices are in the same jurisdiction. Now, once you reach the mid-level as a solicitor, you tend to make around $178,000 to £300,000 a year. Partner, you're around $400,000. And if you're a US top-tier partner in London, you probably make $430,000 plus. And then, of course, if you're an equity partner, the world's your oyster. You can be making millions and millions as a senior equity partner. Now, the reason why I don't like to talk about salary is that is only one side of the coin. The flip side is the cost associated in becoming a lawyer. And believe me, you have to pay to play. First, it is so difficult to get into law school, especially a top tier school like an Ivy League or an Oxbridge. And for Australia and the US, you need to first complete a 3-year bachelor's degree and then sit the LSATs before you can even apply for law school and to get into the Juris Doctor program. And in doing so, you need to be incredibly smart, you need to be disciplined, you need a plethora of extracurricular activities under your belt, you need to be competitive, and you need money. And I want to speak bluntly here. The only way you can really achieve working as a volunteer or an unpaid intern, which is often a requirement in order to make up and build up these extracurricular activities on your CV, is if you have some sort of monetary support to pay for basic necessities such as food and shelter. And whilst, yes, there are various law schools which may be easier to get into, you have to remember law is very pretentious. So if you're looking at these big law salaries and you want to work at these top tier international commercial law firms, the fact of the matter is you need to come from a good law school. Now, exceptions do exist, but do not fall into the trap of thinking that you are the exception to the rule. Second, if you are lucky enough to secure a slot in law school, first off, congrats. But secondly, you then need money to become a lawyer. Now, most lawyers, they have a big university debt, especially in America where your debt can be over $200,000. And don't forget that debt increases over time. And not to mention the salaries that I've talked about, they're pre-tax. So they're not what hits your bank account. Finally, there is an opportunity cost in being a lawyer. It takes at least 6.5 years to become a lawyer in Australia. And that's made up of 3 years completing your bachelor's, 3 years completing your Juris Doctor, and then at least 6 months completing your practical legal training. And after all of this, the work isn't over. In fact, that's when the real work starts, and it starts early and it ends late. There's a reason why lawyers at top tier law firms earn good money. And that is because they are working non-stop. Now, corporate law, it demands so much of you. There's expectations that you'll reach your billables, like no matter what. Which is why working 60 to 80 hours per week, it isn't uncommon. Which means now the opportunity cost is missing out on your family get-togethers, birthdays, catching up with your friends, spending time with your loved ones, even just spending time with yourself. So is the reward worth it? Is law worth it? Look, it depends. There's so many factors to it. And if you really want me to dive into this question, then let me know in the comment section below and I'll make a video on it. But otherwise, thank you so much. If you learned anything new, hit the like button, press subscribe and turn the notification bell on. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you on the next one.